With a fully functioning and executable React app set up on our system, we are now ready to dive into the Create React App folder structure. Now, if you remember when we talked about the Create React App NPX module that sets up our application for us, I did mention that React in all reality does not dictate the folder structure or the file structure of your application. If you wanted to, you could have an application that is one JavaScript file, and in that JavaScript file, you have all of your components in there, like all of the JavaScript that makes your application execute could be in that one file. Unfortunately, that would be extremely hard to take care of. It would be extremely big and pretty confusing for developers if they needed to go in and change a particular component. So the standard practice is to begin to break up your application based on concerns. In other words, we're following that good old-fashioned separation of concerns model that we've talked about both when we learned HTML and CSS as well as when we learned JavaScript. We're simply separating the concerns and providing a logical flow or structure to our application so that it's easier to find what we're looking for and to update it and take care of it. And with this Create React application, they simply came up with a good folder and file structure and kind of a pattern and methodology for structuring a React app so that it's easy to take care of and easy to understand. It also takes care of transpiling our React app when we write our JavaScript using modern JavaScript that may not be compatible with all browsers. In other words, this React app, because of the way it was set up, it will take care of taking ES6 or JavaScript 2016 syntax and transpiling it down to ES 2015, which is better understood by the majority of browsers out there. So it allows us to write our React with modern JavaScript and still have it transpiled down to older JavaScript so that it's compatible for more browsers. And that's the benefit we get from using Create React App. Now, to better understand Create React App and the application structure, we're going to go through this application structure folder by folder and file by file to make sure that we understand how it all works. Now, the Yarn lock, this is provided by Yarn, and Yarn is a utility that is being used within the Create React App for transpiling and compiling and making sure we have the right node modules and other modules in our application that we need in order to do the transpiling of the JavaScript, as well as making sure that we can build it for production and all that kind of stuff. So Yarn is a tool that is being used under the hood by the Create React App. Now, we're not going to go deep into Yarn. Yarn is very similar to NPM. It is a package manager, really useful, and it really depends on what you like, whether you like Yarn or Grunt or NPM or any of those JavaScript dependency managers. It's up to you. Now, they used Yarn and NPM in the Create React App. So you don't really need to worry about this yarn.lock. It's auto-generated when the application got set up. The README, of course, this provides any information you need to know about how the Create React App application works, how you build and test and run using Yarn. We're, of course, going to be using NPM for that, but you can use Yarn if you'd like. And this just gives you links, of course, to all the documentation for Create React App. Good resource. If you get stuck or if you don't understand something, jump to this or go to the Create React App GitHub page and read through the documentation. We've already been through the package.json. It's the same as any other package.json that we've used in the past when we learned about NPM and Node. So go ahead and go through it again if you'd like. Git ignore is, of course, there for Git. We've used these in other applications and projects, or you should have. It just excludes things that we don't want inside of our Git repository. You can add to it and remove from it based on what you want stored in your GitHub. Totally up to you. Now, here's where we get into the meat of it. The node modules, we're aware of what node modules is. It's, of course, where all of the NPM modules get stored that we are using. Here, all of these are used for the transpiling of the code from ES 2016 down to ES 2015. And we really don't need to worry about that unless we really want to get deep into how transpiling works. And I think I will have a video on that later in order to help you understand transpiling. But right now, just know that all these node modules are really just here as utilities used by NPM and Yarn in order to compile and transpile our JavaScript from ES 2016 into a compatible version, ES 2015, that will be sent out and used in production across all browsers. Now the public folder right here. Now the public folder is where all of our static resources are. In other words, resources that would be served up by our web server as static content. Content that doesn't have to be dynamically compiled, modified, or manipulated in any way. Such as an icon, our index.html, which of course is that single HTML page that makes this a single page application. We just have this one HTML page. It's the one page that gets spit out by the web server to the client. And once this HTML is on the client side, it will pull in all of the JavaScript that is required for our single page application to run. And then, of course, our application will be injected into the page. And from that point forward, it's really React and our components that make it feel and act like a multi-page application, even though it is a single HTML document that gets served up by our web server. And then, of course, any images that we plan on using in our application. Of course, we've got the React logo in here because this is by default what is put out when we start up our application. If you remember, when the application first runs, we get a generic React app page that comes up. Well, these are the logos that are loaded into it. The manifest.json has information about what is being pushed into that index.html page, about our application, as well as what icons we have for it, all that kind of stuff. And then the robots.txt. You'll learn about robots.txts later on. This is specific to websites and restricting what robots or search engine robots can go through in your application, or telling them what you want them to index. So we won't worry about that right now. Now the source, this is where the meat of our application happens, is right here in this source folder. Now SRC stands for source. In other words, this is where all of our source code goes. And as we build our application, we will be doing everything inside of this source folder here. The app.css, this is the primary style after our public style sheets that we might have in the public folder here. This is where all of our component-specific styles come in, and we will learn about component-specific styles later on in an additional screencast. But right now, know that anything that has a .css that's inside of this source folder should have the same name as one of these JS files, which would be a corresponding component. So here we have our app component. This is the primary orchestrating component for our React application. In other words, it is the mother of all components in our application. It is the main or primary component that gets loaded into our HTML page, and it gets put in right here on this root div. So that's where it will live inside of our HTML page. And it is the mother of all components. It is the parent component for all components in our application. And the app.css is the styling for that specific component. Then we have a generic app.tests.js. This is where, when we saw inside of our package.json, we could see that we have a tests command where we could do npm tests or yarn tests. Well, that particular command will search through our source file and look for all files that have a .test.js in them, and it will execute those. And these will be the ones that will test our React components, because we will import the React component, and then we will begin to test that component. Now, we'll learn about testing our React components in a later screencast, but just know that anything with .test.js is a test, and it should correspond to a component. So here in our example here, you should see that we've got an app.css, which is the style for the app component. We've got an app.js, which is the actual JavaScript file that holds our React component. And then we have our app.test.js, which holds all of our tests that test to make sure our app component is working the way we would expect it to. Now in here we had our index.html, which is the root page for our entire single page application. Well, with it, we have an index.js, which is the JavaScript file that is imported into our index.html file, and it is what imports and injects our app.js component, or our app component, into this page. It's really the one that's in charge of setting up the React app inside of our index.html when that page gets loaded inside of the client's browser. So it's an extremely important part. And this index.css, this is your generic CSS for the entire application. You should be putting all of your generic CSS for the look and feel of your application inside of this index.css file, as it will be imported into the HTML, the index.html, just like this index.js. Then you can have a logo right here that you can import, and you'll see that the logo is actually imported here into your app.js. And so if we look at that logo, and then we see right here logo.svg, it is a SVG version of the React logo. And SVG, of course, is just the mathematical or coordinate. It's really mathematical and coordinate description of these same logos right here. SVG is pretty nifty. But if the SVG is not supported by the browser, you can use any of these logos down here. Now the service worker right here, this is an optional part of React, and we won't get into that right now, but it is a feature of React where we can use a service worker to accomplish tasks in the background for our React app. And we'll get into those later on. We won't cover those right now. So we won't be doing a lot with the service workers right now. And that right there covers all of the Create React app components that make the application. And as we begin to build our to-do app, as we learn React, we'll begin to see how to modify this folder structure to better organize and lay out our application and make it more meaningful to us as we build out our own application. This is simply a starting place. It is a starting structure for our React app, and we can modify it and alter it any way we want based on the front-end application that we're building and how we want to organize our code. So we're going to go ahead and stop right there. If you need to rewatch this video, make sure you understand what each of the files and folders are used for, and make sure you understand how the React app is simply a scaffold or a structure that helps us better organize our React code when we are building a single page React application.